Okay, good evening. To, this evening, I want to talk about the way my own style of speech of documenting political and social problems of interest to me that were generated by my own life online and in self-published books essentially without gatekeepers evolved, and why that's controversial. And I want to make one of the points out, one of the most important points immediately is that this did not depend on social media algorithms, which started to sort of come into play around 2008 or so. I was basically being found by search engines, and to some extent in the beginning by the word of mouth from my book in the late 90s. But mainly by search engines, mainly Google, because it indexed everything free. And in the early days, flat sites, just simple HTML sites without databases and without all the fancy stuff, often scored higher because it was easier for Google to index them in the very early days. And so that's how I was able to be very influential in some of the policy areas, particularly gays in the military and don't ask, don't tell. But later on, internet censorship itself, the Child Online Protection Act, and even some issues like filial responsibility laws and trademark, and even one particular other national security incident that I won't get into here. But this style actually, it didn't pay its way, because people paid very little for this, except a little bit for the books. But I didn't normally have advertising. And I didn't really have a real business, so this is actually quite controversial how I did it in some people's minds. And I just want to go over the history of it a little bit. The heart of the matter, of course, is the history of Section 230, and there's the Cornell Law School's page for it. 47 U.S. Code 230, protection for private blocking and screening of offensive material. There were a couple of problems very early in the middle 90s as people started to get internet access. And I'll state also my own course was that in early 1996 I had a one-page website that advertised my coming book, which at the time was going to be called Do Ask, Do Tell, a Gay Conservative's Opus. Later on, then I got an AOL hometown page, which at one time only allowed one text file. But in October of 1996, on a Sunday afternoon, the first Sunday of October in 1996, AOL enabled its members to use unlimited FTP files and create websites with the idea of members.aol.com/ and then the directory and file name. And so essentially I had from that time on unlimited publishing with no gatekeeper, and people started to find it. Even that got indexed. Also, AOL had some good message boards that got well known, but it was mainly the FTP enabling in October of '96. On July 11th, 1997 is the day I officially published my first Don't Ask, Don't Tell book, Do Ask, Do Tell book with the Library of Congress. I don't think I usually have been showing you this page, but it was that book. And then and then to continue, in August of 1997, a friend at the workplace actually hosted a website for me. At that time he called it virtualnetspace.com, and I started putting a lot of essays and footnote files particularly extra footnotes for the books on that site. And then on July 31, 1998, I put the books online, and it was sort of an honor system. I wanted you to pay for the books if you could, but you could look at it free on HTML files if you wanted to and preview it. I did not have an elaborate system for running a business, charging credit cards and that kind of thing, like most authors did, and that's kind of controversial in itself. On December 2nd, 1990, the first site was called hppub.com and named after High Productivity Publishing, which was the name I gave my publishing company. So I called the site hppub.com, and these are a couple of images from what that page looked like back then. To show a couple of them. This one showed some 7 topics and showed the four books that I had at one point, and had some various sections. And this one's another view of what it looked like at one time in 2003, I think. And then the Do Ask Do Tell site, which started in 1999, eventually looked like this, with the names of my blogs on the left side of the page, and with the other contents, the book reviews, movie reviews, play reviews, and other stuff on the right side of the page. So, but they were all flat files. In 2006, I started using Blogger, and I had up to 16 blogs for about 16 years, and they were shut down at the end of 2021, or on January 3rd, 2022. I also had 4 blogs on WordPress. 2 of them started in the start of 2014, and the other 2 started in May of 2016. And so blogging had come into popularity in the very late 90s, maybe around 1999 or so, but I didn't really catch on to it until 2006. Heather Armstrong and the case Deuce was famous for her blog, and she got fired from a job for talking about the workplace. And there was indeed a big controversy over, we were starting to realize that the internet was supposed to be the Wild West of free speech, but the first concern, of course, was exposing children to it, and that's when you had the Communications Decency Act, which tried to define indecent speech and being viewable by minors. And that part of it got struck down in the summer of 1997. I actually went by the Supreme Court. I actually went to the 3-minute line to the hearings in late March of 1997 myself. That was before I moved to Minneapolis and before I published the book. But the Section 230 part of the law was kept, and that's the part that protects web hosts, and particularly now platforms, social media sites, from downstream liability for most torts, except for copyright. That's separate with the DMCA safe harbor, but it protects them from downstream liability, even if they make a good faith effort to moderate content. And there had been a couple of cases, one in which I think CompuServe had been held to be just a distributor of content and wasn't liable for something that a user published, but then I think Prodigy was held liable because it did moderate content. So that was what generated the wording of Section 230 to refer specifically to content moderation. And so it wasn't just simply about downstream liability itself, it was about content moderation. And allowing the platforms to remain immune if they made a good faith effort to moderate the content. And so it's how profound this was. Is that this gave somebody like me who didn't even have a real business and wasn't active, and politically I vote, but I wasn't active. I didn't raise money for candidates or raise money for issues or work with people in a conventional way, the way people are normally expected to. But I still managed to have an influence on things. And that's something that a lot of people probably don't think is okay. Here's a legacy page on Section 230. That I'll give you the link to that. And then there was also quite a bit of a furor in the early 2000s about whether bloggers were violating campaign finance reform, even when their content by giving candidates essentially free PR, and whether that could cause a lot of blogs to shut down. That went away, but that was something I was very concerned about. The other thing was that I would mention about Heather Armstrong's site. I was very concerned in the early days that if somebody had had a position in the workplace where they managed other people and passed judgment on, approved other people's raises, or if they were even teachers who gave people grades, that kind of thing. And if they were active online expressing their opinions, and if they were found by search engines, I was very concerned that that could create a conflict of interest, just as I was very concerned about conflict of interest over my book that led to my moving to Minneapolis. And I have a white paper on that. I think, see if I can, I didn't prepare that ahead of time, but I think I have a white paper on that. It should be under special topics. Yeah, here it is. This was read quite a bit. White paper, employment agreements regarding employee-owned intellectual property, conflicts of interest, trade secrets, non-disclosure, and non-competition. I wrote that essay online in March of 2000, and it got a lot of attention over the years, even though a lot of people weren't that aware of it. And so when social media came along, that sort of took a lot of the pressure off of the concerns I had, because now everybody was it was a free-for-all again, and everybody was saying what they wanted. And that, for a few years, that seemed to go reasonably okay, until about 2015 or so, once Trump became the candidate, then once we had Charlottesville, and once it started having all the censorship, then we wound up having a situation eventually where, partly because of the provocation from the right and from the Trump side, the left became much more combative, using critical race theory and now gender ideology, and then trying to say if people were in a marginalized group, that gratuitous speech might incite others to harm them further. So speech like mine possibly should be shut down, simply because if it doesn't actually pay its own way, if I don't need it to make a living, if I'm using money that I inherited or money that I made through capitalism, from the stock market or something, if I'm doing that, the inheritance is a good question. I won't get into that right now, but that could be tricky. That would give me an unfair advantage in the political scene, and it's hidden and it's covert, and it ought to be shut down. That would be what the radical, and it could put marginalized groups in extra trouble. And of course, we all know that with gender theory, there is, in many people's minds, including mine, the idea that some of the creation of marginalized groups seems to be a bit artificial, but definitely subjective. But we've talked about before in other places. The other thing I was very active, of course, was the litigating the Child Online Protection Act, which came along in came along in 1998, the child on which basically tried to replace the Communications Decency Act with hope I can find it here. Here it is. The building in Philadelphia where we had that's the building in Philadelphia where we had the trial in 2006 and 2007 regarding the Child Online Protection Act, and I attended one day of that. That sort of tried to replace the censorship part of the Communications Decency Act with something that talked about if a site was commercial, and you could say that my sites weren't, but I argued that they could be viewed as commercial anyway, but they did promote the books somewhat. So I argued that it could be, and then there was in the back of everybody's minds, there was the possibility of this McCain-Feingold business affecting things. But the idea was that they defined a term called harmful to minors, which is similar to indecent. It's a lower standard than obscene, but specifically harmful to minors, and there were some phrases about it on a commercial site. And a lot of it might have been thought of as applying to commercial porn. And as I've said before, a few states have now tried to ban or hold platforms liable if they allow porn without requiring a verification that somebody's an adult in order to log on. And COPA had tried to essentially require that you force users to verify they're adults if you had harmful to minors material, which was said to be impractical at the time. It's probably not as impractical now. But that was a very interesting part of the entire experience. But the main thing I kind of wanted you to get out of this is that even without, and this is very important, even without social media and the algorithms, which became the subject of the Section 230 trials earlier this year, and I think they were overturned in May. I think I did a video about them in February. And even without the algorithms, and even without things like Cambridge Analytica during, affecting the election and everything, even without all of that, just merely being found on search engines before social media came along was a relevant observation. And I'll just make one other observation that just occurs to me. The standard, a lot of what seems to be going on is a lot of people have a hard time as in an individualist society, making it, and with individualistic values, and a lot of people feel they will will be basically rejected by other people personally and for jobs just because they're not as competitive. And so allowing people to organize themselves into marginalized groups and then giving special protections to marginalized groups would counter the fact that hyper-individualism seems to allow a lot of people to fall through the cracks. And that's our serious problem right now for free speech. But anyway, that's kind of what I wanted you to get. That's kind of what I wanted you to get out of this today. It looks like I blew my own picture away. So I do thank you for listening, and we'll talk again soon.